Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. The end of the currency war is near. You can tell because the Japanese special currency attack units are being deployed. Yes, the Kamikaze currency traders, aka the Kamikaze traders, have been ordered to the front line of the currency war. Stacey?
Max, yes, you know that this currency war is raging as the US dollar collapses. And the latest big step, of course, has been Germany asking for their gold back, Azerbaijan, Sweden, Netherlands, Austria. Everybody's looking for their gold. Where the heck is our gold? Well, over there in Japan, where they were famous for their kamikazes, especially from 1944, the end of the war, revolutionary Japan is suddenly the center of world affairs. So Japan may not slide into genteel oblivion after all. To the surprise of the Japanese people, their country is smack in the middle of two riveting dramas that threaten to upturn the global strategic landscape in short order. Of course, we see the conflict, the hot war building between Japan and China. But the majority of this piece is about their all-out monetary war, but now fiscal war. And Shinzo Abe, the new prime minister, is basically getting rid of the Bank of Japan independence because he's saying that they're not financial, they're not one of these Japanese special financial units. They're not doing kamikaze enough. They're not destroying the currency enough. It's only down 12%, for example, this year, only since the beginning of the year against the dollar, and 20% against the euro.
Right, and I read somewhere that Paul Krugman, the American suicide banker, economist, is applauding the move. Gold has hit new all-time highs in yen terms. The Japanese people are scrambling to get all the gold and silver they possibly can to protect themselves against suicide bankers and a suicide prime minister. And this is playing out exactly as we started this war. And so I'm the primo general in this war, and I instruct the troops to keep buying gold and silver to protect against suicide bankers in Japan and a suicide prime minister and a suicide economist like Paul Krugman. Of
course, the only difference now between the kamikaze pilots of the currency unit there and back in World War II is it's a much older generation, so they're all wearing adult nappies, of course, or adult diapers. So you have suicide pilots wearing adult diapers, which is actually what started with that NASA pilot woman who was famous for wearing her diapers and driving across country to go try to kill her boyfriend.
Well, they're they're triply incontinent. The third being their inability to hold on to the printing presses. So they have diarrhea of the printing press, and they're not taking any kind of medicine to stop that.
Now, you mentioned that Paul Krugman likes this policy, and I'll tell you, it was actually Ben Bernanke who likes the policy on which this is modeled, because they say this is a near copy of the remarkable experiment in the early 30s under Korkio Takahashi, described by Ben Bernanke as the man who brilliantly rescued his country from the Great Depression. Now, what he did was devalue the currency by 60%, 40% on a trade-weighted basis, which prompted a trade war with the British Empire at that time, who imposed all sorts of tariffs. But Takahashi was assassinated by army officers in 1936 when he tried to tighten by cutting military costs. Policy degenerated, and Japan later lurched into hyperinflation. So even Ambrose Evan Pritchard says, yeah, it was great, though, from 1932 to 36 until he got assassinated and the hyperinflation came. But we should follow his policies.
Right, it was great until the assassination. Darn. Well, yeah, comparing this period to the 30s is wrong-headed as well, because in the 30s there was a liquidity crisis. Yeah, they could have benefited by printing more money, but this is an insolvency crisis. And until you get rid of the terrorists on Wall Street in the City of London, no amount of printing is going to end the crisis.
So, Abe has forced the Bank of Japan to basically lose their independence. And as Ambrose Evans Pritchard says in the Telegraph, it's probably not the last to lose their independence. And they're setting an inflation target of 2% to be achieved by, quote, unlimited bond purchases. Now, the Telegraph goes on to say about this unlimited bond purchases, the liquidity effects of this by the world's top external creditor could be large enough to leak into everything from New Zealand bonds, Brazilian equities, and Chelsea property, a sort of carry trade on steroids.
Yeah, this is the Fukushima of interest rate policies and monetary policies. So they're going to unleash a tsunami of cash onto the world markets to benefit people who are speculating in the housing market. The people who are working for a living will be wiped out. Again, back to the World War II analogy, of course, this would be the central banker's final solution.
And it's not just on the monetary side, though, that they're going to go full-on bonkers. On the fiscal side, Mr. Abe will launch combined national and local stimulus worth 20 trillion yen, or 4.4% of GDP. No matter that the budget deficit is already 10% of GDP, or that total financing needs are a record 60% of GDP. The IMF is advising Japan not to push its luck, saying, even the IMF is saying this is crazy.
Right, now this will end up with a hot war with China. I mean, that's what we're seeing. This is Japan basically declaring war on China through the currency market. So we're in World War III. Japan and China are now at war through the currency markets. They've got ships positioning themselves out down in that region, and they're ready to do a shooting war. So we're there, Betty. We're there. We're in World War III. I would like to encourage you to keep buying gold and silver.
Well, the Japanese pension funds are starting to buy gold, and they do mention that the Japanese pension funds are now net sellers of Japanese government bonds because of all the people.
They listen to me. They listen to me, Mrs. Watanabe. I'm talking to you, Mrs. Watanabe. Forget the carry trade. Forget the speculating in the Icelandic krona. Buy gold and silver. Your husband's down at the pub getting drunk right now, as he is every night. He won't even notice the working stiff in Japan that are drunk. You need to call up your broker right now and buy more gold and silver, Mrs. Watanabe. Yes, and you have a very lovely daughter.
Well, this currency war, of course, they do mention, because during the first currency war of the 1930s, by the guy who got assassinated by his military men, that prompted the empire of the time, which was on its very, very, very last legs, was the British Empire. That prompted a fierce trade war. So they do also say that the U.S., who is the empire and looks after Japan, could be very angry about further currency devaluation. As I said, the yen is down 12% against the dollar only since the beginning of this year.
Well, no, this history of assassinating people who go against the central banks, you see in Japan. Of course, JFK in the U.S., he went against the central banks, and in '63 he was taken out. So, no, Bernanke is not going to challenge the paper printers because he doesn't want to end up, riding in an open-top convertible somewhere with his brain splattered all over his wife. That's not a pleasant ending for a central banker, is it?
Well, that's a good point, because this guy had been operating, Takahashi had been operating this extreme money printing experiment for 4 years before he got killed by the military. But, they were fine with it until he tried to impose austerity upon them, upon their pay. So this is one thing we've always said, is that the millionaires versus the billionaires versus the trillionaires. And once they start fighting each other, once they have to give up their bonuses, their city bonuses, or whatever it is, you could see the beginning of these elites starting to assassinate each other.
Well, we can only hope.
Well, speaking of hope, okay, so we looked at the Japanese monetary and fiscal policy. Now, here's the finance minister, Taro Aso. Remember, everybody's an Aso?
Who can forget Taro Aso? The biggest Aso in Japan. Who can forget him? He's the finance minister, right?
Yes.
What an Aso that Aso is.
Well, he's in this headline. Let elderly people, quote, hurry up and die, says Japanese minister. Taro Aso says he would refuse end-of-life care and would feel bad knowing treatment was paid for by the government. So he was doing the rounds selling people on this new budget they have for the new government. Heaven forbid, he said, if you were forced to live on when you want to die, I would wake up feeling increasingly bad knowing the treatment was all being paid for by the government. The problem won't be solved unless you let them hurry up and die.
That's right, Mrs. Watanabe. Some fella, finance minister in Japan named Aso, wants you to kill yourself for the benefit of his paper-pushing bankster buddies down there at the Bank of Japan. That's not right, is it? What are you going to do about it? How about some You know what? They got that special sushi in Japan made out of the blowfish. Yeah. If you eat too much of it, it kills you. How about Mrs. Watanabe goes down to this asshole's office and serves him a nice luncheon of deadly sushi? How'd you like that, asshole?
Well, 25% of Japan's 128 million population is over 60. Within the next 50 years, it's going to be 40%. And he...
Yeah, because they're all going to be dead because this guy asshole wants to kill him so that he makes money speculating with Goldman Sachs.
Well, you know, going back to World War II, first of all, he's called these old people doddering old fools, basically, that should get a job. He himself, he says, I'm 72 and I work. But his background, Max, he's the grandson of a former prime minister. His wife is the daughter of a prime minister. His family's wealth comes from coal mining. And he did use Allied prisoners of war as slave labor, forced labor during World War II. So he himself is well off.
No, his original name was Mr. Yakamoro. It's only later the public decided to call him asshole. That was his new adopted name because he's an aristocrat who uses slave labor and wants to commit genocide amongst old people because for some reason he's frustrated that his wife treats him like the garbage that he is, asshole.
Well, he's proposing a sort of final solution to the budget problem in Japan. So I want to have a quick final headline here to bring it back and close it with World War II. How the Vatican built a secret property empire using Mussolini's millions. Papacy used offshore tax havens to create £500 million international portfolio featuring real estate in the UK, France, and Switzerland. But, Max, they've discovered that the church's international portfolio has been built up over the years using cash originally handed over by Mussolini in return for papal recognition of the Italian fascist regime in 1929. So in terms of Asso's and Abe's plans for killing off the old people, essentially, who's going to be the one that blesses their, plan?
It's not going to be Jesus. Jesus had no part of that.
The Buddha.
Jesus checked out of the Catholic Church long ago because of the in bed with the fascists. They own part of London.
Well, this is the thing. We're going to cover this actually later. I want to get an expert on this. But they own huge swathes of London using Mussolini's money, who Mussolini paid them this seed money in exchange for blessing his fascism. But this is what...
Hello, Ratzinger? Jesus on line 1, and he sounds angry. All right, Stacey Edward, that's all. We got to go. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, stay tuned for the second half. I'll be speaking to MI5 whistleblower Annie Méchant.
Victims multiply here each day.
It's very profitable to invest in Colombia. Very profitable. There's a very high return on investment. I've been working in this area for 30 years, and I've always had to pay the armed groups. The paramilitaries have changed their name and strategy, but they're still the same murderers.
High-ranking suspects give no comment.
What do you have to say about that, Mr. President? Mr. President? I won't give an interview. I'm sorry. But no.
Investigation is a dead end.
It says, stop your bullshit and keep quiet or else you'll suffer the consequences. And tell your bodyguards to watch themselves too, because the same goes for them.
Blood rivers for gold's sake.
I've never heard of such a case as ours where so much money and gold has been stolen for so many years.
For all the gold in Colombia on RT.
Welcome to the future.
Science, technology, innovation. All the latest developments from around Russia.
We've got the future covered.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to former MI5 officer and whistleblower Annie Méchant, now of LEAP, the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Annie, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, Annie, you say there's a third front opened in the global war. There's the war on drugs, the war on terror, and now we have the war on the internet. Elaborate, and who benefits from this?
Well, I think the military-industrial complex benefits the most. I mean, this is something that President Eisenhower talked about 50 years ago. But I would now reclassify it as the military-security complex, because security is big business. And surveillance is big business across the planet. It's a sort of race between the governments and the corporate elite to try and crack down on our freedoms. And they use those three wars to do that as justification. So you have the war on terror, of course, has brought about the Patriot Act, and it's shredded our civil liberties in the UK. The war on drugs has been used for the last 40, 50 years for exactly the same purposes globally, and has caused interventions across the planet on the part of the US. And now we have the major corporations, the major entertainment corporations, trying to crack down on the internet, which of course is vital to the free flow of all our information, the free flow of our speech as well. Right,
so just to unpack this phrase military-industrial complex a little bit, because people have used it now so much, it's become, I think it's lost some of its meaning, but when you say military, you're talking about the government, and when you're talking about industrial, you're talking about corporations. So you're talking about fascism.
Exactly.
I mean, fascism. America is suffering from fascism. Yeah. They've got the Pentagon will go on Jon Stewart's show, you know, in the second half, and they'll push war. Yeah. And so he totally condones this industrial military complex in America, and that's considered the alternative media. So they love it. The Fox News promotes it. The military, the Pentagon goes on Fox News. They engage America in wars, and people die, and they celebrate that because they're fascist. You know, fill in the epithet from there. All right, so you've got the internet, which is becoming, going the way of the war on terror, war on drugs, and of course the war on drugs, we've got beheadings in Mexico. So at what point does an Aaron Swartz, instead of just threatening to put him into a gulag, does a government, the fascist in Washington, just decapitate him? When's that coming? Soon?
Well, certainly we're seeing a reclassification of internet activists, as well as activists in the real world, as domestic extremists and, in fact, terrorists. So, for example, Occupy on the streets of London, where they were warning the police in the City of London that they could potentially be a terrorist group. So activists are now being classified in that way. Activists are now being persecuted and watched and infiltrated in exactly the same way as terrorist groups or drug cartels. And I think we are sliding very rapidly to a point where the state will start incarcerating and deeming them to be terrorists. And of course, once you're deemed to be a terrorist, you're outside the due process. Anything can happen to you. You can be extraordinarily rendered, kidnapped, thrown into a secret prison, even tortured. That's what's going on.
This is all being normalized.
Yes.
So the beheading of internet activists will come just as chopping off the heads of folks in Mexico. I would imagine Martha Stewart would have a show, How to Decorate Your Home, with the decapitated heads of your family members that have been fascistically assassinated extrajudicially because they threatened the next Hollywood blockbuster. You know, so Martha, that's a good idea for a show. Heads on pike, what color?
Well, of course, what we should be doing is decapitating some of the banksters who are, you know, ruining our planet.
They'll be doing collateralized debt obligations based on the decapitated heads on spikes designed by Martha Stewart, brought to you by Lloyd Blankfein. He'll be making, of course, oodles and oodles of money on this, as he always does. Now, you were a whistleblower for MI5, and part of the whistleblowing was about domestic surveillance. Much of the population today feels that they have nothing to hide. So what do you think about that response?
It's not about having something to hide, it's about having a right to privacy. Why should the government have access to every aspect of your information, your personal lives? And yet we're sort of offering it up now. We've been groomed by ghastly TV shows like Big Brother, where if you win that, you get onto a C-list celeb lifestyle. Or, for example, Facebook, where, again, you're encouraged to offer up all your personal information. So Facebook, for example, is doing precisely what the spy's wet dream, gathering the sort of information that we would have been gathering on subversives or domestic extremists. And it's not just the official spies we have to worry about these days. We have the undercover cops, and we also have this explosion of mercenary spy companies, which are sent into the Middle East for security muscle, but also are infiltrating all the activist groups around the planet, including the internet activist groups. Who can you trust? I mean, there was a case with Lulsec, one of the hacker groups, Sabu was one of the leading hackers in that group, and he was caught and turned by the FBI. So who can you trust? It becomes very corrosive to a cohesive sense of society when you have to look over your shoulder because someone might be reporting on you. It's like living under the Stasi in East Germany.
Right, I don't know if you saw the story a couple of weeks ago about scientists had hacked into the brain of a cockroach and connected it to Twitter.
Was he in the Senate in the US by any chance?
This was an insect, and they had hacked into the cockroach's brain, and it was being controlled by Twitter. So the Twitter tweets that were coming in through Twitter were having an effect on the cockroach and steering him. So when I think about Americans who are hooked up to these social networking sites being surveyed on by the fascists in Washington, it's not about that they need to protect themselves, their privacy, so much as they're being steered like cockroaches into the consumer end of society, into the debt end. Because without the debt and without these cockroach Americans being steered by the Pentagon into being over-indebted, the economy would collapse overnight.
Well, don't forget they've got the military as well to buff up the economy. I mean, it's big business now in prisons.
They say either go into debt and be a consumer whore, or we'll assassinate you extrajudicial. But it'll look great because Martha Stewart will do the fabulous color job on your assassination.
Have you heard about Face Deal? This is a spin-off from Facebook, where if you are a loyal customer to certain places, they will use facial recognition technology in the restaurant you go to or the shop you go to, feed it back to Face Deal, and then you'll get little updates on Facebook saying, oh, well, you know, you can get a special discount next time you visit. So, in fact, we're being bribed to allow corporations to spy on us.
Right. Americans will give up their liberties for $5 off a pizza.
Yeah.
That's unfortunately the state of America today. Now, speaking of privacy, Kim.com in New Zealand is relaunching his mega site, the uploading of material. And you know, he was extrajudicially targeted by MPAA, Chris Dodd. I'm sure if he could have just assassinated him on the spot, he would have, but he's in New Zealand, so Chris had to hire some mercenaries to go get him. But he's relaunched Mega, and he says it's all about privacy. And of course, this is potentially a game changer for Hollywood because they've done an end run around what many consider to be completely unconscionable copyright laws that destroy the creative industries. Do you think this will have a chance? Do you see it? I don't know if you looked at Mega too. What are your thoughts?
No, I think it's a very good initiative, and it won't destroy the creative industry because what he's offering is that artists can upload their stuff to his sites, and they will get 90% of the revenue generated by that. It will destroy the middlemen, the pimps, the people who control the publication of books or the creation of music or the creation of films. And it's that industry that is getting heavy in trying to crack down on internet freedoms because their business models bust.
That's a good point to make, is that the artists are going to be getting more of the cash. The distributors in Hollywood, Universal Studios, Steven Spielberg's company, Lionsgate, these other distributors who are just taking money and they're lobbying through Washington in a way that subverts the whole idea of the creative industry by lobbying for perpetual copyright. They're the copyright whores in effect. They're doing the damage. Chris Dodd and the MPAA are extrajudicially assassinating the copyright as it was iterated by Jefferson in the Constitution, Article 17 originally.
Absolutely.
So this could be a burst of creativity by getting around the copyright gatekeepers that are destroying, and of course to make up for the revenues, they end up producing films that are pornography and violence. I mean, that's the Lionsgate bread and butters, just violence and pornography.
But the other issue about this is, of course, if you allow the media corporations to build an architecture on the internet so they can spy to see if anyone's infringing copyright, then the architecture is there for the spies and the governments to survey us as well. You can't allow the media corporations to look at us without allowing those powers to be abused by other segments of government. So it's a very dangerous path to go down. It's almost like the copyright industry is being used as a stalking horse by our governments, by the elites, in order to erode still further our privacies. And it does subvert the whole democratic process. I mean, look what happened with ACTA, anti-copyright trade agreement in Europe, where the European Parliament, even the parliamentarians, weren't allowed to see the terms of that trade agreement. It was signed quietly, and it was going to be imposed quietly until, of course, a bunch of activists got involved and spread the word, and there were demonstrations across Europe, and it was kicked out. So we've got to get active.
Aaron Swartz's father says the government killed his son. What are your thoughts?
I think they bear a diabolical responsibility. This is a man who was turned his back on corporate life, wasn't interested in making money, was very interested in internet freedom, and walked the walk. And for doing that, for just trying to copy some files which he had an absolute right to access anyway, he was hounded and faced 35 years in prison, in a maximum security prison, for doing that, for trying to liberate information for the good of humanity. Now, I can't think of anything more grotesque than that.
Is there an end game to this? In other words, if the corporations in Hollywood are going to push the public only so far before you have an American Spring type moment and they seek regime change, as is dictated in the Constitution. That's every American's responsibility to overthrow their government if the tyranny takes over. Are we at that moment yet, do you think? Or the Americans are just too drugged up and obese?
I think we're getting very close to that moment, and it'll probably tip when when people recognize the American economy is bankrupt. I mean, it is already, but most people don't want to accept that. So as things get harder, as prices go up because of food shortages, as energy goes up, I think that scarcity will tip the population into that moment. But I also think there's a sort of arms race between the corporatists to crack down and take away all our freedoms and to make sure it's endemic surveillance society before that point is reached, so that when the people do take to the streets and try and string the banksters up on the lanterns, it's too late because every movement can be followed. It's like some sort of dystopian future that even George Orwell couldn't have foreseen.
Right. You know, it's funny that in America, the Federal Reserve will say, well, we're fighting deflation. Meanwhile, at JP Morgan and Blythe Masters here in London, they're cornering all the commodity markets, agricultural markets, the silver markets, the precious metal markets, because they know that the economy in America, in the UK, is essentially bankrupt, and that hyperinflation is 100% guaranteed, and they want to be positioned to be controlling, as you make the transition from the paper markets of the post-Reagan Thatcher deregulatory environment to the new commodity-based economy, the new gold-based currencies that will take over for the dollar and these other fiat currencies. But for some reason, people in America, they see that their prices are going up, their standard of livings are crashing, but they buy this idea that the Fed's fighting deflation. Is it just financial illiteracy, or do they instinctively know that the fact that they haven't been destroyed yet is due to the cheap prices that come their way, relatively speaking, to people in Cairo or Athens because of the fascists in Washington and the Pentagon?
I think more and more people are beginning to understand that. But I think we are going to reach a tipping point where there is so much scarcity that people will have to do something about it. It's going to become bleeding obvious. We've had it so easy for so long since the Second World War, at least in the West. We've had no scarcity, we've had a rising standard of living, and that's, of course, all reversing now. And there will be a change, a big change afoot, I think, in the coming years.
All right, Annie Méchant, we're out of time. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank my guest, Annie Méchant of Leap. If you'd like to contact us, please tweet us at Keiser Report or at facebook.com/Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.